I'm Liza, and Penny and Karen and I are thrilled to have you all come out on this very cold night. I have to tell a little story. I emailed Bill this morning to make sure he was still going to be able to make it. And he said, but of course, it's a real Vermont kind of day. Which it is. But tonight we have Bill McKibben. And as you all undoubtedly know, he's spoken and taught and written about the environment for many, many years. He is currently the Schumann Distinguished Scholar in Environmental Studies at Middlebury College, a fellow at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and he holds honorary degrees from 18 colleges and universities. He's been awarded so many prizes, numerous prizes I'm not even going to list, but they include the Gandhi Prize and the Thomas Merton Prize. He was a former staff writer for the New Yorker, and he frequently writes for a wide variety of publications all around the world, including the New York Review of Books, National Geographic, and Rolling Stone. And he's a founder of the important global grassroots movement, 350.org, which, does anybody here not know about 350.org? You did a good job. The End of Nature came out almost 30 years ago and is regarded as the first book for the general audience about climate change. A lot has changed in 30 years, not enough. That was followed by more than a dozen others revolving around themes of nature and the environment, including the one about becoming an activist, which I found very interesting. Radio Free Vermont is Bill's first novel. To create this fable, he's taken localism and environmental issues, and he's mixed them up with wit and humor, and he added quite a bit of hijinks and craft brew. Naomi Klein writes about this. This is James Bond meets a Prairie Home Companion. And no one but McKibben could pull it off. He does it with such heart, grace, and wisdom and fun. I just couldn't put it down. A story as outrageous as our times. Please join me in welcoming Bill McKibben.
Well, thank you very much for that. A great pleasure to be here. I was actually a little glibber than I should have been about getting over here. Middlebury Gap was a sight to behold, and about as many cars didn't make it down as did when I was coming over, so I'm especially glad to be here and to see old friends, and it is kind of fun to get to talk about this book. I really have I've rarely written a book that would be a plausible Christmas present for anyone before, it must be said. I've enjoyed immensely all the reviews because they've all talked about that it's a very funny book. It's possible that a good way to make sure that people say that is to write nothing but depressing and sobering books one after another. It's possible that it's just the equivalent of a dog getting up on its hind legs and walking. You don't really critique the gait. You're just sort of, impressed by the fact of it. It's a book I wrote over many years, not actually expecting to publish it, really. It was sort of for fun. Mostly while I was away. I've spent much of the last 10 years, much too much of it, on the road. Some years well more than half the time, as we've been sort of building this climate movement out around the planet. And so one way to keep from being entirely homesick about Vermont was to write a little bit about it. And it's also kind of a MASH note to the resistance that I've been a part of for 10 or 12 years now, and that has really burgeoned and blossomed beautifully in the last year. I gotta say, I feel far better about the world than I did 24 hours ago. Partly it's that beautiful, fluffy snowstorm, which really feels like a Vermont snowstorm for once to have a storm where it gets cold at the end instead of starts raining at the end is such a pleasure. But the other was, of course, the news last night from Alabama, closer than it should have been, whatever, but a sign, maybe, that if we keep working, we can break this fever that our country fell into. It's worth the try anyway, and it's good to have really something to remind us that there are good-hearted people all over the place, not just Vermont. I will read just a tiny bit, and then we can discuss any number of things. But I thought maybe I'd read just a little bit from almost the beginning of this book. It's a book about a sort of accidental, almost rebellion that gets underway in Vermont, and it's really mostly in the name of the small and the local and the real, as opposed to the large and homogenized and distant. So, well, right at the beginning, it's also a book, it must be said, Liza alluded to this, but it's fairly well soaked in beer. One of the things I like best about Vermont is that we have more breweries per capita than any place on the planet now, and some of the very best ones. And I like that because I like the taste of it all. But I also like it because that's really where the beginning of what we now know as the sort of local food movement and everything else really started. In the mid-1970s in the UK, with the campaign for real ale that crossed the pond, and suddenly people started figuring out how to brew beer close to home. We went from 20 breweries left in America in 1980 to 4,000 now. If you're in Vermont and you're drinking beer that comes from more than 500 yards away, you're doing it wrong, So that's really to me, it's just a good symbol. So I'll read this little part. A beer truck lumbered slowly off the Crown Point Bridge and began the drive up Route 22 toward Burlington. And the Crown Point Bridge is over my part of the state, crosses Lake Champlain from New York. It hadn't gone a mile before the driver came to an orange detour sign in the middle of the road and turned left on a dirt farm track. He drove about a mile more, past cows staring impassively at the sides of his truck, with its pictures of two young women in bikinis reclining in a hot tub and hoovering Coors Light long necks with an ardor that suggested deep and full-bodied pleasure. Around a bend in the road, the truck driver found another detour sign and followed it for 2 miles till yet another sign guided him down a dirt road next to a creek lined with willows, a creek still flowing in the mild January chill. After a mile of that, with the road turning into rut, he came upon a lady in a balaclava holding a stop sign. The driver braked, and as he did, 2 young men also in balaclavas appeared, one on either side of the truck. Each had a tire pressure gauge, and within seconds air was hissing out of the front tires and the trunk slumped slightly forward. "Apologies," said the lady in the balaclava. "This will take a little while, I'm afraid. If you wanted to walk to the nearest house and call the police, that's fine, but it's about 4 miles. Or you could wait a little while, and then we'll fill your tires again. Anyway, we've made you a picnic." She put a paper sack on the seat behind him and started lifting things out. "BLT with bacon from Vermont Smoke and Cure. Here's a whole pint of Stratford Creamery maple walnut ice cream. And here's something special, a bottle of the new Long Trail Coffee Stout from Bridgewater Corners. You can only have one because we're serious about DUI in this state, but I think you'll find it filling. And we've got a gift pack of beers from 51 of Vermont's brewers to send home with you. Did you know we had more breweries per capita than any place on earth? I have no idea why they think we need Coors too." While she talked, the 2 young men were busy hauling down cartons of the Coors. They opened each, quickly twisted the caps, then turned the whole box upside down to drain. When the bottles were empty, they loaded the cartons in the back of 2 pickups. The driver watched for a minute and then spoke. "Hey, lady," he said, "this is going to take forever. I've got 1,200 cartons of Coors in that truck. Why don't you just toss them over the side and let me go?" The woman looked up at him from above a draining carton of beer. "Oh, sweetie," she said, "this is Vermont. We recycle." There's a lot of there's some more meditative passages, which I'm not going to bother to read you tonight, and some parts about the particular beauty of this part of the world in its great minor key glories, which appeal to me inordinately. Though I've seen the grand landscapes of the world, there's almost no place on earth I like better than the eastern forest, and especially on a day like today with that fluff and I think tomorrow is going to be a grand day, sunny, and with that still fluffy snow, we should catch every kind of diamond facet that there is. It couldn't be more beautiful. But I'll just read you a little more of the kind of funny stuff. One of the ways that organizers know that things are going well is when things begin to happen spontaneously, that they're not organizing themselves. So, for instance, I'm looking at Gus Speth in the back of the room and remembering the day that the time that we spent in a jail cell in Washington at the start of the Keystone Pipeline fight. Now, I had to work really hard to get that organized, and we had 1,200 people there finally that got arrested. It was the biggest civil disobedience action about anything in this country in many years. But once we'd done that, things began to take on a life of their own, and without anybody doing conscious organizing, suddenly, without us doing it anyway, there were every place the president turned up, there were people with signs and banners, and just on and on and on for years, and it continues to this day with dozens of organizations and millions of people in this fight. That's really when things are going right, because what activists are trying to do more than anything, I think, is not change particular laws or pieces of legislation, but kind of change the zeitgeist a little bit, to get people thinking a little differently about what's normal or obvious or important. And so I'll just read about one night when this was sort of starting to happen in this movement that these guys had almost accidentally sparked, that sort of turned into a push for Vermont to secede from the Union. Okay? That night, some Wikipedia-wielding historian noticed that it was the 247th anniversary of the day in 1777 when Vermont declared its independence from Britain. Since he also happened to be the Dorset volunteer fire chief, not to mention well into his second four-pack of Fiddlehead's bracing Second Fiddle IPA, he sounded the siren on the top of the firehouse for several minutes in celebration, which would have annoyed all the men who answered the call if he hadn't had several four-packs in reserve. They had cell phones. Before the deadline for the 11 p.m. news, half the towns on the western side of the state had sounded their alarms, and coverage on the late newscast from WCAX was enough to convince the Norwich, Vershire, and St. Johnsbury departments that they were missing out on the fun. The next morning, 5 postmasters in Caledonia County arrived at work to find the American flag neatly folded in a regulation triangle on the front steps and a Vermont banner flying from the pole. 4 replaced the flag. The 5th called the local newspaper to take a shot, and by noon the picture was spread across the top of the New York Times website to illustrate a feature story titled, "In Quaint Green Mountain Hamlets, a Push for Independence." By early evening, 2 young men with a piece of rope set up a free Vermont border check on the Addison side of the Crown Point Bridge. As incoming cars with New York plates slowed to a halt, they handed each driver an apple and a flyer advising of national customs and cultural sensitivities. Vermonters do not like having their pictures taken, but if you offer them a beer, they will usually allow it. Before the day was out, Ben & Jerry's had announced a new flavor made with Vermont milk and maple syrup. The lid showed Ben & Jerry holding the new flag, the new Vermont flag, along with a newly discovered quote from General Ethan Allen. "Ever since I arrived to a state of manhood, I have felt a sincere passion for liberty and ice cream with a high butterfat content." Vermont Public Radio put out a press release acknowledging that its switchboard had been overwhelmed with calls from listeners who thought it was un-Vermont-like to continue describing itself as a member station of National Public Radio. We will take no position on this controversy, the station said, but we encourage all sides in this dispute to pledge their support in our winter fund drive, which begins tomorrow. I will add, I found it particularly funny that alone among Vermont media, Vermont Public Radio is the only place yet to ask me anything about this book, which adds to the joke in my mind. In fact, there's a lot about radio in this book, as you can tell from the title. It really, in part, is a kind of, it draws on, not on public radio so much, but on the wonderful radio station in our part of the state, which I think you guys can probably just barely pick up here, WDEV out of Waterbury, the last great independent radio station almost in the country. The hero, the septuagenarian leader of this rebellion, owes a lot to a guy named Ken Squire, whose father founded that radio station in the early 30s and who continues to operate it to this day. And at the very end, the character has he's every morning for his whole life, really. He's done the morning call-in show. And one of the reasons that he's sort of become the firebrand, a little accidental firebrand that he is just this sense from talking to people day after day after day that Vermont wasn't working quite as well as it used to, that the communities that marked it were beginning to break down, that people were getting lonelier, which I think is, I think Vermont retains, for a variety of reasons we could discuss, far more community than most places in the country. But I also think it's true that like every place else, it's beginning to take its toll here. At any rate, they're getting towards the very end of this saga. Town meeting day is going to be the key event where people are going to vote on secession or not. And after doing a series of underground podcasts to try and get people fired up, they finally decide at the end that they have to take the risk, even though the feds are on their tail, of coming above ground enough to do an actual sort of call-in radio show, to let people call in from across Vermont to kind of say their piece and to talk about it. And I'll just read you from the very, very end of it, the last call, just as the police are about to close in. This is Art from Essex Junction. I just want to say, I think this whole secession thing is so stupid. The U.S. is the greatest country on earth. If we were off by ourselves, we'd be crushed. We'd be Haiti with Holsteins. That's it, just stupid. Ed, thanks for the call, said Vern. And that's the right note to end on, because I think you're wrong. I think we'd be more like Finland with fall colors. I think we've got plenty of brains and resources to do just fine on our own, but you may be right. And that's the point. I've sat behind a microphone and listened for decades as Americans learn to stop talking with each other and start shouting instead. No discussions, just socialist or fascist or feminazi or bigot or whatever. So here's what I want to say, and I think it's the one thing no one ever says anymore in our public life. I think you're wrong, but you may be right. And I really do think that that's important. The publisher called this book a fable when they published it, which was fine by me because, as I said in the author's note at the end, an advantage to writing a fable is that you get to append a moral. In this case, it's not we should all secede. Instead, it's that when confronted by small men doing big and stupid things, we need to resist with all the creativity and wit we can muster. And if we can do so without losing the civility that makes life enjoyable, then so much the better. And I think that really is the place we're at right now. I have very firm convictions about the world and the arrest record to back them up, but one tries to operate without rancor or bitterness. And I do think that that's been one of the real blessings of Vermont. I think sometimes about what would happen if someone like our president talking the way that he talks and tweets and things showed up at a town meeting in Ripton, where I live. And, you know, people would look slack-jawed at him for a minute or two as he tiraded on, and then they would just move on. I mean, someone would say, okay, thank you, sit down now, it's time for someone else to talk, and that would be that, you know. I think that that's a very good thing, and one to try hard not to lose if we possibly can going forward. So I'm going to stop reading there in the interest of having discussion, and we can talk about things literary, we can talk about things political, we can talk about where we are, we can talk about things scientific and where we are with the climate and whatever at this point, whatever you want to talk about. But I just want to end by thanking the folks at the bookstore very, very much. Y'all obviously understand that all those communities that took their local independent bookstores for granted no longer have their local independent bookstores, and there's an awful lot of communities in America, an awful lot bigger than Norwich, for which that's true, you know, at this point, sadly. Someone asked me on TV the other day, just at the end of the interview, said, so people can get this book anywhere, right? Meaning you could go on Amazon or whatever. And I said, yes, you could, but really you shouldn't. You should, this is one book you should definitely get at your local small bookstore, because that's what it's all about. And it is. So thank you all very much for having me here tonight. It's really a pleasure. There I will stop. Fire away.
Next question. I was wondering if you still have time to teach at Middlebury.
I don't teach too often at Middlebury because I'm on the road so much, but Middlebury has this great, one great thing about it is they do this thing called January term, where everybody takes just one course for January. I think in part it's because January's so dark that if you didn't give kids a chance to go out and ski in the afternoon, you'd have mental health problems of a high order. But it actually turns out to be a great thing, I think. Just taking one course really intensively every day for a few hours is a great way to, I think, to learn something. It's definitely a great way to teach something, because people aren't distracted by anything else. And it always makes me wonder how we ended up with the kind of pedagogical system we do, where you do 60 minutes of Spanish and then switch immediately to 60 minutes of chemistry and things. It doesn't seem, I mean, it seems like a kind of, you know, if you think about it for a little while, like a kind of parlor trick that we kind of force people to do, and not really a very good way to understand or think about things. That's a long answer to, but I do, so sometimes I do get to teach still, and I quite enjoy it.
Particularly, do you try to go to the January term?
Yeah, if I teach, that's when I teach, and because I want to go out and ski in the afternoon too. You know, it's a, and I got to say, if you're looking for a good place to ski at the moment, Breadloaf, you know, up there, the sort of mountain campus of Middlebury is about as good as it gets right now.
What do you say to people that you encounter in audiences who are climate deniers?
Well, I encounter it on purpose. Yes, what do I say to people who are climate deniers when I encounter them in audiences or elsewhere? So it's a really good and interesting question. One answer is, though I end up a lot in that situation, and I can tell you the things I say, I try not to spend an immense amount of time worrying about convincing people, okay? 70% of people in America understand more or less what the problem is. They don't all get how urgent it is, but they understand what's going on, which is actually pretty good. I mean, we're a country where 50% of people tell pollsters that Elvis is still alive. So, you know, 70% getting basic physics, chemistry is okay. But the, he might be, but the 30% that are climate deniers, and this is the only place in the world where there's a significant percentage like that, okay? The 30% aren't actually likely to be convinced by, it's not that they're lacking one crucial piece of information about sort of infrared absorption in the upper layers of the stratosphere or whatever it is. It's ideological. I mean, if you've spent the last 30 years sort of marinating in Rush Limbaugh, this is more or less, you know, the chances of kind of changing your worldview in a profound way are small. That said, there are people who you can reach. There are people for whom the fact that the Pentagon takes very seriously climate change and often identifies it as the greatest of the problems that we face is meaningful. There are people, including many evangelical Christians, for whom the fact that this has become a religious issue in many quarters is important, and often I find, especially with evangelical audiences, people have been on mission trips to the developing world, and hence they're quite they understand what you're talking about when you start talking about drought and so on in much of the world, and are open to that. The real problem, though, is not convincing that 30%. It's getting some percentage of the 70% active in doing something about this, okay? That's the much more important challenge at the moment. Because if we can get any significant percentage of that up and moving, then we'll win. It only takes 3, 4, 5% of people actively engaged in a fight to win the fight. That's because apathy cuts both ways, you know? And we're not there yet. We're 1 or 2% or something of Americans who are actively engaged. We've built a big movement, but not yet big enough, I think. And so we keep pushing hard. When, you know, you find yourself at Thanksgiving or Christmas or whenever with a kind of crazy uncle who just will not relent, I say usually, well, I hope you're right. And if goaded beyond endurance, I will sometimes just say, you may not believe in global warming, but global warming believes in you. And that's where I'll go.
So who's your dream ticket in 2020, Bill?
Well, you know, I don't know, God knows what's going to happen in 2020. I do take it as a good sign that our junior senator is by far the most popular politician in America. All the polling data shows. And I take it as a good sign, not only because I like him, but because I think what he really demonstrated when he ran was that these ideas that a bunch of us have had in our heads and hearts for many years were not the fringe ideas that people had always told us they were. You know, I remember introducing Bernie the day that he announced on the shore of Lake Champlain. Me and Ben and Jerry introduced him. And I remember thinking that 5,000 people that gathered there on that beautiful day was going to be the biggest crowd he would draw in his entire campaign. You know, 2 months later, I introduced him at the convention center in Boston, and there were 38,000 screaming young people who by then had already memorized his entire 90-minute stump speech and were saying it back to him as he said it. It was the craziest thing I ever saw. But what it meant was that, you know, ideas like giving people health care were not strange ideas that Americans couldn't fathom and, you know, so on. They were, in fact, entirely popular and made intuitive sense to people. It was a great moment when in I think the first debate with Miss Clinton, the moderator said, "What's the most important issue in the world today?" And without missing a beat or even blinking, Bernie just said, "Well, climate change, obviously." even though, I mean, obviously it wasn't his main thing that he cared about in the world. You know, I mean, he's spent his whole life focused on inequality, and good for him to be doing so. But just the kind of basic understanding of the sort of rational outlines of the world in which we live was a very refreshing thing to see in our political life. So the good news is that there are now thousands of people who cut their teeth in that campaign and are now running for things all over the place. Not a day goes by when I don't get another letter, another email from somebody, some often younger person that I know who's suddenly running for Oregon State Senate or New Mexico, you know, assemblyman or whatever. You know, I'm quickly running out of $50 to send them each, but it's, you know, it's really invigorating to see that happening. So I don't know what's going to happen at the top, but I'm pretty sure that from the bottom there's a terrific groundswell underway.
I got a letter, an email today from a friend who said that he decided to run for something and he didn't have much support yet, but Bill McKibben had endorsed him.
There you go. Probably in lieu of sending him $50. Yeah.
Speaking of marinating, are you marinating another novel?
No, you'll be happy to know that I'm hard at work on a long, depressing tome about the 2019 is the 30th anniversary of the end of nature. So I'm not rewriting it, but I am sort of trying to take stock of where we are in the world, which sadly is not a very, very good place. You know, one tries very hard to stay cheerful, active at work. There are days when reading the scientific literature makes that difficult to carry off. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration put out a big study on the Arctic yesterday, and the sort of, you know, at the end of the second paragraph of the executive summary or something, it said, it seems unlikely that the Arctic will resume its reliably frozen state as we have, you know, known it for. I mean, that's a fairly major change that we've managed to make on the planet. I mean, this is one of the 3 or 4 largest physical features on Earth, and we've managed to break it. And we're doing the same to most of the others. So I intend to keep writing and organizing about all this a while longer. And then once it's clear we've lost, then I'll stop and write novels again for a while maybe, or something. We'll see.
I had the pleasure of hearing Paul Hawkins speak a few months ago, and I wish that you were on the stage at the same time to have a debate with him. He is really focused on solutions, saying we know what we need to do and how to do it, and we just need to do it, and it's actually already happening. And was critical of the climate movement and climate warriors using language about conflict and war to motivate us. And I'd just be curious to hear if you've spoken with him.
Oh yeah, there's no debate. I mean, I helped with this book Drawdown. It was on the sort of advisory committee and talked and worked a lot with Paul, who's an old friend of mine, on it. And I think it's absolutely right and good project that's underway. And he's absolutely right that there are lots of solutions now coming into view. You know, I spent much of the spring in Africa doing a story for the New Yorker about, I was partly there working with our 350 crew in parts of Africa, which was really moving to see people standing up to coal-fired power plants and things in Africa and doing a great job. But I was also doing a story for the New Yorker about the rapid spread of renewable energy across rural Africa. There's more than 1 billion people on our planet without electricity. There are more people without electricity. This is one of these good statistics. There are more people without electricity on Earth now than there were the day that Thomas Edison invented the light bulb, just because there's so many more people on the planet than there used to be. Of that billion, most of them are in Africa, And on current trends, most of them will never get electricity. The grid is expanding with infinitesimal slowness outside big urban areas. There's no reason to think it'll ever reach most of Africa. But within the last 18 months, the price of a solar panel has dropped to the point where now it's possible for lots of entrepreneurs to figure out how to take this technology and put it to work sort of hut by hut. Everybody there's spending 30 cents a day for kerosene for a lamp. Once you've figured out how to finance it, how to kind of aggregate it, and having the mobile phone is pretty key to that, you can take that 30 cents a day and it's enough to purchase on time a solar panel, an inverter, a battery, like 5 lights, a cell phone charger, maybe a small TV. It's amazing to see that happen. I remember sitting in I was in one village in Ghana near the equator, so 95 degrees all the time, you know, and was sitting there talking with the village elders about the solar microgrid that had been installed the week before. You know, there's 40 solar panels to serve 75 small homes in huts in this community. They kept handing me bottles of cold water, for which I was grateful because it was really hot, but I couldn't figure out in my sort of clueless Western way why they were so proud of this stuff they kept handing me. It was because, as it dawned on me eventually, until the week before when they'd installed this solar microgrid, there'd never been anything cold in this village before. Cold wasn't even really a working concept in this place, you know. And now, thanks to this sheet of glass with a little silicon inlaid, you know, I mean, you point it at the sun, and out the back comes light and cold and communications. That's wizardry that's Hogwarts style wizardry, you know. That's the most unbelievable piece of technology that we've ever come up with on this planet. And so the fact, and as Paul points out in the book, there are lots of drawdown, there are lots of other possibilities like this. And the point is that we're engaged in a race now to see how fast we can put them up. I just finished a piece for Rolling Stone that was out last week or the week before. The whole point, I mean, the title of it was "Winning Slowly is Another Way of Losing." And on climate change, that's the sad truth. Unlike all the other battles that we've fought over the years, all the other pushes for social justice of any kind, this one's a timed test. Like, you know, Trump is doing everything he can to screw up healthcare in America, okay, and he seems to be succeeding. And if he succeeds, lots of people will suffer, and they will die, and they will go bankrupt, and it will be horrible. But 4 years from now, or 8 years from now, God forbid, or whatever, it won't be materially harder for the next person who comes along to do the obvious and rational thing and treat healthcare the way that every other, you know, industrialized country on earth treats it. They'll be able to build that system. The fact that we neglected it for 8 years won't have made it impossible to do it. Climate is the exception to that rule. If we don't solve it very soon, we will never solve it because the momentum of it builds upon itself and the feedback loops become ever more vicious. So we're warming, you know, permafrost at 1/4 degree to 1/2 degree a decade now. As we do, it begins releasing large quantities of carbon to the atmosphere, so on and so forth. Past a certain point, we have no real ability to control it anymore. So, I mean, one can call it a war, or one can call it a race, or one can call it whatever it wants, but there's nothing like a guaranteed happy ending here. There's only the possibility for trying to force the spring, trying to make the political and economic systems go much, much more quickly than they would go on their own, because left to inertia, we'll eventually get there. I mean, 75 years from now, the planet will be running on sun and wind because free is a difficult business proposition to beat, you know. But if it takes 75 years to get there, that sun and wind will be powering a broken planet. If we get there in the next 5, 10, 15 years, then it'll still be difficult. We're not going to stop global warming. We're in for real trouble, but we may not be in for sort of civilization-breaking trouble. We'll see.
And when I asked you to elaborate on that, you just said 10 or 15 years. So candidly, what do you think our window of opportunity is?
So that's a good question. What's our kind of window of opportunity? I mean, so two ways to answer that, three maybe. One, we don't really know. This is an experiment we haven't run before in real time, so we don't exactly know where each phase of it comes in. Two, we've already missed the window for some important things. I mean, we've bought ourselves a huge amount of trouble. There's nothing that anyone has on tap that's going to refreeze the Arctic, at this point. Three, all we can say with any surety is the faster we move, the less damage will get done. So far, we've raised the temperature of the Earth 1 degree Celsius. Even if we do everything right at this point, there's enough momentum in the system that we're going to go to 2 degrees Celsius or pretty darn close, and we're not doing everything right, obviously. Our country, and this is probably the thing from the Trump years that's so far most appalling of all. Our country, alone among countries on the planet, has now backed away from the international effort to deal with the greatest problem that it faces. The country that contributed most of the carbon to the planet is the one country, I mean, even now, as of last week, Syria is signed up with the Paris Climate Accords. We're the only nation that has gone back on its word, broken its pledge. We should be ashamed of that. But even if we did everything right, we'd end up at 2 degrees. On the current path, we're probably headed for 3.5, 4 degrees Celsius. Each one of those increments is much, much worse than the one before. 1 degree is bad enough. I mean, California is on fire today, okay? We saw what happened with the kind of storms we can now cook up this fall. 2 degrees is going to be very, very difficult. 3 and 4 degrees probably take us to the point where things just start coming unglued in truly epic fashion. So we shouldn't go there, and it's worth everything we can muster to try and keep us as low on that scale as we can.
So your fable is focused on localism. And I'm wondering how you think that ties into the climate solution and how scalable what we're doing in Vermont is and how relevant we are to other places.
So what a good question. This novel's local and it's about localism. How does that tie into the sort of global solutions that we need on climate, and how do we take some of the things we're doing in a place like Vermont and scale them? If there was ever an argument for a world government, climate change would be it. They don't call it global warming for nothing. There's no doubt that the most efficient way to deal with it would be at the very top. And the good news about, the best thing about the quite mediocre Paris Climate Accords was that they represented not a world government, obviously, which actually probably would be the worst possible idea, but they did represent a powerful international effort to come to some kind of agreement on this most difficult of problems. And it was, though mediocre in its actual pledges and things, it was nonetheless stirring to be in Paris and watch countries that represented every possible extreme of human experience, of economic experience, everything else, agree on something, okay? Now that, say, in this country, it's clear we're not going to keep our word, it's become also clear that it would be a very good thing to have local communities, states, regions, everybody else doing this work close to home. Jerry Brown has convened a summit next September that's going to be a sort of Paris-style summit, but not for nations, for what in the invincible jargon of the UN we're now calling subnational actors. So mayors, governors, people who head arrondissements and, whatever, all gathering and bringing with them pledges about what they're going to do in terms of converting their places in the direction we need to go. Some of that work has been extremely hopeful. In this country, in the last year, we've managed to get a lot of big cities to agree to go to 100% renewable energy in the not so distant future. Some of them were easy. You can get Berkeley to agree to literally anything that you ask it to. But, St. Louis had, home to the two biggest coal companies left in the country. That surprised me that they agreed. Atlanta, San Diego, Salt Lake City. The day that Trump pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord, you may recall, he said, "I was elected to govern Pittsburgh, not Paris." This is one of these cases where you really want your speechwriter to do a tiny bit of advance work or something, because 2 hours later, the mayor of Pittsburgh said, "Well, you know what? We're going to go 100% renewable energy. Thank you very much." That kind of response is really important. It should be said that it's a lot easier to get politicians to agree that they're going to do something 20 years from now than it is to get them to stop doing the bad things that they're doing at the moment. And so a huge part of this push has to be the more difficult task of getting them to stop expanding the fossil fuel enterprise in the here and now. It was extraordinarily depressing that we were not able to stop the state of Vermont from building a new natural gas pipeline down the west side of the state 2 years ago. That's got to be the last piece of this infrastructure that we put in any place in Vermont. The idea that we put that in is a assertion that 50 and 60 years from now, which is when that thing will be paid off, we're still going to be using fossil fuel. If we are, we're in huge trouble. The thing that Vermont should be doing, and it has special expertise with, is the work that we started with the Vermont Energy Efficiency, VEIC, our efficiency utility in essence. Vermont's very good at that kind of work of figuring out how to conserve energy. We have, in much of the state, Green Mountain Power. In Green Mountain Power, the closest thing to a really conscientious utility that there is in America. I mean, literally, I think you can count the number of enlightened utility CEOs on the finger of one finger, okay? And Mary Powell at Green Mountain Power is that one person. I've seen some of the places where they've gone and converted, in the course of a few days, working class old Vermont homes by putting in a ton of insulation and an air source heat pump, which is an amazing piece of technology in its own right, and maybe a solar panel if there's a southern exposure, and in the course of 3 days turned a house to close to, reduced its carbon emissions unbelievably. At the same time, even paying for those new appliances and new insulation on people's electric bill reduced their overall energy bill. That's really important kind of work, and it would really help the people in this state who need it the most. Bernie, who's been talking to you about this in the last few weeks, is going to sometime in February holding at least one big energy fair in the state of Vermont to try and get everybody there just for that kind of pitch, sort of to figure out how they're going to do that kind of thing. That could scale and should scale. It takes a lot of work to make it happen. The keys are more about finance at this point than they are about technology, but it's incredibly important.
One of the ready for 100% renewables is the town of Hanover.
Oh, good.
And I think one of the things that's interesting about that is Hanover has a very, very strong, committed town manager. And so the town is having a bunch of different projects, has had. And it always makes me feel like, are we people keeping up with our towns that are very progressive? I think it's a very interesting challenge to inform and inspire the different factions of our government.
Absolutely, and there's lots of good sort of chicken and egg stuff here as activists push towns and states to do the right thing, and then as they do the right thing, it makes it much easier for everybody who isn't an activist to do the right thing in their own home, because now the correct subsidies or policies or whatever are in place. I mean, even little things. I mean, it costs half as much to put up a solar system in Germany as it does in the United States. Not because the solar panel's any cheaper, because they've just figured out how to cut through all the, it's much, much easier to get the permits to do it, that kind of thing, than it is here. So there's tons of room for good progress here, and we're starting to make it. We really are. I mean, that's the good news. Trump can do a lot of damage, and he is doing a lot of damage in terms of big macro things about energy, and this new tax bill is an abomination in this field as in many others. But I think he probably won't be able to totally stop the momentum in the direction of in the right way. It's just, if we're in a race, and I think we are, he's slowing us down at a crucial point. We better think of something more optimistic to end on than that.
Yeah, the Hanover effort, actually, Ready for 100, is leading other towns in the area to sign up. Lebanon has a committee that we're on to do the same. But another local issue here, you mentioned the pipeline, maybe you've heard of this. Liberty Utilities over in New Hampshire wants to build a frac gas storage facility and put a pipeline through the streets of Lebanon up to Hanover. The Hanover decision will help stop that. Many local groups are working hard and will stop it.
As hard as you can and as fast as you can. Our sense with these things is they're much easier to beat before they're actually half built, before anyone's actually poured the big chunk of money into doing them. You can often run them off. One of the things we've discovered is, and this really surprised me, often when we fight, we win. I didn't think we had the slightest chance when we started the fight against Keystone. No one had ever really tried to take on a big fossil fuel project, in part because people just viewed them as invulnerable. The oil industry has so much money, and they do have so much money, and they will spend it in all kinds of ways that make things hard. But that said, if you can rally enough people, and those people are creative enough in their resistance, then we've been able to beat thing after thing after thing after thing. One of my favorite stories of the last few years was when Shell announced that they were going to go drill in the Arctic for oil. If you think about it for a minute, that's the most insane possible thing. I mean, scientists had explained that if we heated the planet, it would melt the Arctic. We went right ahead and melted the Arctic. Shell did not look at that and say, maybe we should go into the solar panel business, this isn't working out so well. Shell looked at the melted Arctic and said, be easier to drill for more oil up there now, okay? I mean, that calls into question the proposition that the big brain was a good adaptation, But happily, there were enough people with big brains and, probably more importantly, big hearts attached to them that were willing to get in the way. They went out, Shell had to send these huge drilling rigs, 40 stories tall, out of Seattle and Portland Harbor. And before they could get them out of the harbor, people rallied by their thousands in small craft to get in the way. We called them kayaktivists. And they did so much brand damage that by the time the summer was over, Shell tossed in the towel. They said, we spent $7 billion in this, but we're not spending any more because this is hurting our image just too much. Forget it. We're done. There's a lot of cases like that. And who knows what will happen with Keystone, but the fact that we got it going turns out to have been a very good thing. It encouraged everybody to fight everything. And even though we're not able yet, legislatively, most places, to impose a price on carbon, we can, with our bodies really, impose a kind of de facto price on carbon, make it much more expensive and difficult to do these kind of things. And while we do that, with each passing month, the price of a solar panel drops another 1-2%, like literally every month. And as we do, the spreadsheet gets harder and harder and harder to justify this stuff. That's the other kind of race we're in. And for that one, I have a good deal of hope. I'll leave you with this a couple of pieces of good news. I was just writing about this today, sort of trying to bring it together, because a lot of it got sort of ignored in the middle of the completely insane news cycle into which we now live. But the efforts that activists have been making for the last, in many cases, decade or so, to start breaking the financial ties that undergird all this are finally paying off. About a month ago, the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is the biggest pool of investment capital on planet Earth, announced plans to divest from fossil fuel. That was particularly significant because they made all their money in oil. And in essence they were saying, you know what, we're cashing in our chips in the hydrocarbon casino. We're going to go find a different casino to play in from now on. 2 days ago, the biggest insurance company in Europe, the French insurance company AXA, announced that they were no longer going to insure or fund tar sands pipelines. They said it was not ethically possible to do it anymore, and anyway, it made no financial sense. Later that same day, the World Bank announced that beginning in 2019, it will no longer provide money for oil and gas exploration or development any place on the planet. Okay? That's not only a fair large sum of money, it's an extremely strong signal to the rest of the world's financial community that this is no longer the place that we should be going. Those were huge victories. I don't know whether they came in time or not, but they were very big, and they go directly to the work that so many people in this room have been doing. Win or lose each of these battles on the ground in local places for 100% renewable energy, to divest the state of Vermont from its pension funds, from fossil fuel, to stop gas facility in Lebanon and Hanover. Win or lose on each specific thing, they are adding up to this large movement that is glacial pace is not a phrase we can really use anymore with the same meaning as usual, but it's taken a long time to get to this point, to get this kind of big movement rolling. But that means that there's now enough push behind it that it will continue to roll, and for a good while. And we will see whether it catches up or not. In the end, in a sense, it's why I am glad that this book's getting well read. We don't think enough about resistance of this kind. Okay? If you want to know how to fight a war, you can go to West Point or Annapolis or the National War College or 1,000 other, or even in a bookstore like this, you can doubtless find 100 novels by, I don't know, Tom Clancy or anybody else, filled with, all the things about how to fight wars. This other kind of resistance, the kind of nonviolent creative resistance that really only began to emerge about 100 years ago, with people like Gandhi, with the suffragettes, with, we don't know. We're always, as we do it, making it up as we go along. Believe me, because I've been making it up, spinning as fast as it's possible to figure out how to do it. It can be really creative and really beautiful, And the more creative and more beautiful it is, the more likely it is to succeed. And so I am grateful to all the people in here I know who've been fighting hard on all these fronts. And so this book's just a little thank you note for that, and an inspiration to figure out how to fight even harder going forward. Thank you all.